Imagine surviving one of the bloodiest wars in history, only to find yourself in a world that doesn't know what to do with you. That was the fate of millions of German soldiers after World War II. The war was over, but their battles were far from done. What happened to these soldiers? What did their lives look like after the fall of Nazi Germany? Today, we're diving into the fates of these men, soldiers of a defeated regime who faced a new kind of struggle. As the war came to a brutal close in May 1945, German soldiers found themselves scattered across Europe. Some were still fighting on the front lines, unaware that their government had capitulated. Many surrendered to the advancing Allied forces, while others were taken as prisoners of war, POWs. The chaotic nature of the war's end left many in limbo. For German soldiers captured by the Western Allies, primarily the United States, Britain, and France, life in a POW camp was difficult but generally humane. The Geneva Convention provided some protection, and they were often treated fairly well compared to those captured by the Soviets. However, that wasn't the case for everyone. Food shortages, overcrowded camps, and harsh conditions meant survival wasn't guaranteed. For those captured by the Soviet Union, the story was far more grim. Stalin's regime had suffered immensely during the war, and Soviet leadership sought revenge. Millions of German soldiers were forced into labor camps, often in Siberia, where they endured freezing temperatures, starvation, and backbreaking work. These camps were essentially extensions of Stalin's infamous Gulag system. Some of these POWs remained in captivity for nearly a decade after the war, with the last few not being released until 1955, 10 years after the war had ended. Conditions were so bad that it's estimated that around a third of the German soldiers held by the Soviets never made it back home. It was a dark chapter in post-war history that's often overshadowed by the Cold War tensions that followed. Meanwhile, in the West, Germany itself was undergoing denazification. The Allies sought to root out the remnants of Nazi ideology from German society, and this applied to German soldiers as well. High-ranking officers, especially those who had been part of the SS or other Nazi organizations, were put on trial. Many were imprisoned, some were executed, and others were barred from holding positions of influence in post-war Germany. But what about the regular Wehrmacht soldiers? The men who fought simply because it was their duty. Many of them returned home to a country in ruins, their military service stigmatized by the horrors of the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities. This led to a complex, sometimes painful process of reintegration. These men had to navigate their role in a new Germany, where admitting to having served in the war wasn't something you boasted about. For the majority of soldiers who did make it home, life was an enormous struggle. Germany was in ruins, its cities bombed, its infrastructure destroyed, and its economy shattered. Returning soldiers faced the challenge of finding work, rebuilding homes, and reuniting with their families, many of whom had also suffered during the war. In both East and West Germany, soldiers were often seen as symbols of a defeated, disgraced regime. Many veterans struggled with trauma, what we now recognize as PTSD, and found it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. Despite this, over the next few decades, both German states would rebuild, though under very different systems, communism in the East and capitalism in the West. Of course, the most infamous of the German military leaders faced a different fate. The Nuremberg trials saw the prosecution of many top Nazi officials and military leaders. The world watched as men like Hermann Göring, Wilhelm Keitel, and Alfred Jodl were tried for crimes against humanity. While the Nuremberg trials were aimed at the leadership, they set a precedent for the accountability of soldiers in war. The trials made it clear that simply following orders was no excuse for atrocities committed. This further complicated the lives of many German soldiers, as they struggled to reconcile their participation in the war with the crimes of the regime they had served. In post-war Germany, especially in the West, a narrative began to take hold known as the clean Wehrmacht myth. According to this view, the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, had been a professional fighting force that had no involvement in Nazi war crimes or the Holocaust, which were instead blamed solely on the SS. This narrative allowed many former soldiers to distance themselves from the atrocities committed during the war. However, historians have since dismantled this myth. Research has shown that the Wehrmacht was complicit in numerous war crimes, particularly on the Eastern Front. As this information came to light in the 1960s and 70s, it forced a reckoning in West Germany, where many veterans had built their post-war lives on the idea that they were innocent soldiers, merely doing their duty. Despite these challenges, West Germany experienced an economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, in the 1950s and 60s, which helped many former soldiers find work and rebuild their lives. With American aid through the Marshall Plan, the West German economy boomed, and many veterans contributed to this recovery. However, their pasts were never fully forgotten. For many soldiers, their wartime experiences remained a painful memory. But as Germany became a peaceful democratic state, these veterans slowly found their place in the new society. In East Germany, former soldiers found themselves in a completely different world. Under Soviet influence, East Germany became a communist state, and many former Wehrmacht soldiers faced suspicion or outright hostility. The East German regime did not celebrate the Wehrmacht's legacy. Instead, it lionized the Soviet forces that had liberated Germany from fascism. Former soldiers in East Germany often found it harder to reintegrate than their counterparts in the West. Many were not trusted by the communist regime, which viewed them as potential enemies of the state. However, as time passed, they too became part of the fabric of East German society, though under far stricter control and surveillance. The fate of German soldiers after World War II is a complex and often tragic story. Some faced harsh retribution, while others struggled to rebuild their lives in a shattered country. The trauma of the war, combined with the guilt of having served a brutal regime, left a lasting impact on many. Today, as we look back on this period, it's important to remember that the end of the war didn't mean the end of the suffering for many of these soldiers. Their experiences remind us of the complicated and often painful realities of war and its aftermath. So what do you think? Should more attention be given to the lives of these soldiers after the war? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's forgotten chapters.